Once again, welcome on in. Thank you all so much for coming. We begin our read through of The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. The King in Yellow is dedicated to my brother. Along the shore the cloud waves break, the twin suns sink behind the lake. The shadows lengthen in Carcosa. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies. But stranger still is lost Carcosa, songs that the Hyades shall sing, where flap the tatters of the king, must die unheard in dim Carcosa. Song of my soul, my voice is dead. Die thou unsung as tears unshed shall dry and die in lost Carcosa. Casilda's song in The King in Yellow, Act 1, Scene 2. Story 1. The Repair of Reputations. Oh crap, and we're starting off with a French quotation. This is gonna be bad. Okay. Ne rayon pas l'effort du plus long tempus qua le notre. Voilà toute la différence. Actually, shouldn't I just have translated that? Oh. Okay, quotation. Do not mock the fools. Their madness lasts longer than ours. That's the only difference. And I accidentally closed the book. We're good now. Okay. Toward the end of the year 1920, the government of the United States had practically completed the program, adopted during the last months of President Winthrop's administration. The country was apparently tranquil. Everybody knows how the tariff and labor questions were settled. The war with Germany, incident on that country's seizure of the Samoan Islands, had left no visible scars upon the Republic, and the temporary occupation of Norfolk by the invading army had been forgotten in the joy over repeated naval victories, and the subsequent ridiculous plight of General von Gartenlaub's forces in the state of New Jersey. The Cuban and Hawaiian investments had paid 100%, and the territory of Samoa was well worth its cost as a coaling station. The country was in a superb state of defense. Every coast city had been well supplied with land fortifications. The army, under the parental eye of the general staff, organized according to the Prussian system, had been increased to 300,000 men, with a territorial reserve of 1,000,000, and 6 magnificent squadrons of cruisers and battleships patrolling the 6 stations of the navigable seas, leaving a steam reserve amply fitted to control home waters. The gentlemen from the West had at last been constrained to acknowledge that a college for the training of diplomats was as necessary as the law schools are for the training of barristers. Consequently, we are no longer represented abroad by incompetent patriots. The nation was preposterous. Chicago, for a moment, paralyzed after a second great fire, had risen from its ruins, white and imperial, and more beautiful than the white city which had been built for its plaything in 1893. Everywhere, good architecture was replacing bad, and even in New York, a sudden craving for decency had swept away a great portion of the existing horrors. Streets had been widened, properly paved and lighted. Trees had been planted, squares laid out, elevated structures demolished, and underground roads built to replace them. The new government buildings and barracks were fine bits of architecture, and the long system of stone quays which completely surrounded the island had been turned into parks, which proved a godsend to the population. The subsidizing of the state theater and state opera brought its own reward. The United States National Academy of Design was much like European institutions of the same kind. Nobody envied the Secretary of Fine Arts, either his cabinet position or his portfolio. The Secretary of Forestry and Game Preservation had a much easier time thanks to the new system of national mounted police. We have profited well by the latest treaty with France and England. The exclusion of foreign-born Jews is a matter of self-preservation. The settlement of the new independent black state of Sudanese, the checking of immigration, the new laws concerning naturalization, and the gradual centralization of power in the executive all contributed to national calm and prosperity. When the government solved the Indian problem and squadrons of Indians, cavalry scouts in native costume were substituted for the pitiable organization tacked on to the tail of skeletonized regiments by former Secretary of War, the nation drew a long sigh of relief when, after the colossal Congress of Religions, bigotry and intolerance were laid in their graves, and kindness and charity began to draw warring sects together. Many thought the millennium had arrived, and at least in the New World, which after all is a world by itself. But self-preservation is the first law, and the United States had to look on in helpless sorrow as Germany, Italy, Spain, and Belgium writhed in the throes of anarchy, while Russia, watching from the Caucasus, stooped and bound them one by one. In the city of New York, the summer of 1899 was signaled by the dismantling of the elevated railroads. The summer of 1900 will live in memory of New York people for many a cycle. The Dodge statue was removed in that year. The following winter began that agitation for the repeal of the laws prohibiting suicide which bore its final fruit in the month of April 1920, when the first government lethal chamber was opened on Washington Square. I had walked down that day from Dr. Archer's house on Madison Avenue, where I had been as a mere formality. Ever since that fall from my horse years before, I had been troubled at times with pains in the back of my head and neck. But now, for months, they had been absent, and the doctor sent me away that day saying that there was nothing more to be cured in me. It was hardly worth his fee to be told that. I knew it myself. Still, I did not grudge him the money. What I minded was the mistake which he made at first. When they had picked me up from the pavement where I lay unconscious since somebody had mercifully sent a bullet through my horse's head, I was carried to Dr. Archer, and he, pronouncing my brain affected, placed me in his private asylum, where I was obliged to endure treatment for insanity. At last he decided that I was well, and I, knowing that my mind had always been as sound as his, if not sounder, paid my tuition, as he jokingly called it, and left. I told him, smiling, that I would get even with him for his mistake, and he laughed heartily, and asked me to call once in a while. I did so, hoping for a chance to even up accounts, but he gave me none, and I told him I would wait. The fall from my horse had fortunately left no evil results. On the contrary, it had changed my whole character for the better. From a lazy young man about town, I had become active, energetic, temperate, and above all else, ambitious. There was only one thing which troubled me. I laughed at my own uneasiness, and yet it troubled me. During my convalescence, I had bought and read for the first time The King in Yellow. I remember after finishing the first act that it occurred to me that I had better stop. I started up and flung the book into the fireplace. The volume struck the barred gate and fell open on the hearth in the firelight. If I had not caught a glimpse of the opening words in the second act, I should never have finished it, but as I stooped to pick it up, my eyes became riveted to the open page, and with a cry of terror, perhaps it was of joy, so poignant that I suffered in every nerve, I snatched the thing out of the coals and crept shaking to my bedroom, where I read it and reread it, and wept and laughed and trembled with a horror which at times assails me yet. This is the thing that troubles me, for I cannot forget Carcosa, where black stars hang in the heavens, where the shadows of men's thoughts lengthen in the afternoon, when the twin suns sink into the lake of Hali, and in my mind will bear forever the memory of the pallid mask. I pray God will curse the writer, as the writer has cursed the world with this beautiful, stupendous creation, terrible in its simplicity, irresistible in its truth. A world which now resembles before the King in Yellow, when the French government seized the translated copies which had just arrived in Paris. London, of course, became eager to read it. It was well known how the book spread like an infectious disease from city to city, from continent to continent. Barred out here, confiscated there, denounced by the press and pulpit, censured even by the most advanced of literary anarchists. No definite principles had been violated in those wicked pages, no doctrine promulgated, no convictions outraged. It could not be judged by any known standard yet, although it was acknowledged that the supreme note of art had been struck in the King in Yellow. All felt that human nature could not bear the strain, nor thrive on words in which the essence of purest poison lurked. The very banality and innocence of the first act only allowed the blow to fall afterward with more awful effect. It was, I remember, the 13th day of April, 1920, that the first government lethal chamber was established on the south side of Washington Square, between Worcester Street and South Fifth Avenue. The block had been formerly consisted of a lot of shabby old buildings, used as cafes and restaurants for foreigners, had been acquired by the government in the winter of 1898. The French and Italian cafes and restaurants were torn down. The whole block was enclosed by a gilded iron railing, and converted into a lovely garden with lawns, flowers, and fountains. In the center of the garden stood a small white building, severely classical in architecture, and surrounded by thickets of flowers. 6 Ionic columns supported the roof, and the single door was of bronze. A splendid marble group of the Fates stood before the door, the work of a young American sculptor, Boris Yvain, who had died in Paris when only 23 years old. The inauguration ceremonies were in progress as I crossed University Place and entered the square. I threaded my way through the silent throng of spectators, but was stopped at 4th Street by a cordon of police. A regiment of United States Lancers were drawn up in a hollow square around the lethal chamber. On a raised tribune facing Washington Park stood the governor of New York, and behind him were grouped the mayor of New York and Brooklyn, the inspector general of police, the commandant of the state troops, Colonel Livingston, military aide to the President of the United States, General Blount, commanding at Governor's Island, Major General Hamilton, commanding the garrison of New York and Brooklyn, Admiral Buffby, of the fleet in the North River, Surgeon General Lansford, the staff of the National Free Hospital, Senators Vice and Franklin of New York, and the Commissioner of Public Works. The tribune was surrounded by a squadron of hussars of the National Guard. The governor was finishing his reply to the short speech of the Surgeon General. I heard him say, "The laws prohibiting suicide and providing punishment for any attempt at self-destruction have been repealed. The government has seen fit to acknowledge the right of man to end an existence which may have become intolerable to him, through physical sufferings or mental despair. It is believed that the community will be benefited by the removal of such people from their midst. Since the passage of this law, the number of suicides in the United States has not increased. Now the government has determined to establish a lethal chamber in every city, town, and village in the country. It remains to be seen whether or not that class of human creatures from those desponding ranks new victims of self-destruction fall daily will accept the relief thus provided." He paused and turned to the white lethal chamber. The silence in the street was absolute. "There a painless death awaits him, who can no longer bear the sorrows of this life. If death is welcome, let him seek it here." Then quickly turning to the military aide of the President's household, he said, "I declare the lethal chamber open." And again, facing the vast crowd, he cried in a clear voice, Citizens of New York and of the United States of America, through me the government declares the lethal chamber to be open. The solemn hush was broken by a sharp cry of command. The squadron of hussars filed after the governor's carriage. The lancers wheeled and formed along Fifth Avenue to wait for the commandant of the garrison, and the mounted police followed them. I left the crowd to gape and stare at the white marble death chamber, and crossing South Fifth Avenue, walked along the western side of that thoroughfare to Bleecker Street. There I turned to the right and stopped before the dingy shop which bore the sign, Halberg, Armorer. Sneeze. I got in time. Okay. I glanced in at the doorway and saw Halberg busy in his little shop at the end of the hall. He looked up and, catching sight of me, cried in his deep, hearty voice, "Come in, Mr. Castaigne." Constance, his daughter, rose to meet me as I crossed the threshold, and held out her pretty hand, but I saw the blush of disappointment on her cheeks, and knew that it was another Castaigne she had expected, my cousin Louis. I smelled her confusion and complimented her on the banner she was embroidering from a colored plate. Old Halberg sat riveting the worn greaves of some ancient suit of armor, and the ting, ting, ting of his little hammer sounded pleasantly in the quaint shop. Presently, he dropped his hammer and fussed about for a moment with a tiny wrench. The soft clash of the mail sent a thrill of pleasure through me. I loved to hear the music of steel brushing against steel, the mellow shock of the mallet on thigh pieces, and the jingle of chain armor. That was the only reason I went to see Halberg. He had never interested me personally, nor did Constance, except for the fact of her being in love with Louis. This did occupy my attention, and sometimes even kept me awake at night, but I knew in my heart that all would come right, and that I should arrange their future, as I expected to arrange that of my kind doctor, John Archer. However, I should never have troubled myself about visiting them just then, had it not been, as I say, that the music of the tinkling hammer had for me this strong fascination. I would sit for hours listening, and was stray and beam struck the inlaid steel. The sensation it gave me was almost too keen to endure. My eyes would become fixed, dilating with a pleasure that stretched every nerve almost to breaking, until some moment of the old armor cut off the ray of sunlight. Then, still thrilling secretly, I leaned back and listened again to the sound of the polishing rag swish, swish, rubbing rust from the rivets. Constance worked with the embroidery over her knees, now and then pausing to examine more closely the pattern in the colored plate from the Metropolitan Museum. "Who is this for?" I asked. Halberg explained that in addition to the treasures of army and the Metropolitan Museum of which he had been appointed armorer, he also had charge of several collections belonging to rich amateurs. This was the missing greave of the famous suit which a client of his had traced to a little shop in Paris on the Quai d'Orsay. He, Halberg, had negotiated for and secured the greave, and now the suit was complete. He laid down his hammer and read me the story of the suit, traced since 1450 from owner to owner until it was acquired by Thomas Stainbridge. When his superb collection was sold, this client of Halberg's bought the suit, and since then the search for missing greave had been pushed until it was, almost by accident, located in Paris. "Do you continue the search so persistently without any certainty of the greave being still in existence?" I demanded. "Of course," he replied coolly. "For the first time I took a personal interest in Halberg." "It was worth something to you," I ventured. "No," he replied, laughing. "My pleasure in finding it was my reward." "Have you no ambition to be rich?" I asked, smiling. "My one ambition is to be the best armor in the world," he answered gravely. Constance asked me if I had seen the ceremonies at the lethal chamber. She herself had noticed cavalry passing up Broadway that morning and had wished to see the inauguration, but her father wanted the banner finished, and she had stayed at his request. "Did you see your cousin, Mr. Castaigne, there?" she asked with the slightest tremor of her soft eyelashes. "No," I replied carelessly. "Lewis's regiment is maneuvering out in Westchester County." I rose and picked up my hat and cane. "Are you going upstairs to see the lunatic again?" laughed old Halberg. If Halberg knew how I loathe that word lunatic, he would never use it in my presence. It rouses certain feelings within me which I do not care to explain. However, I answered him quietly. "I think I shall drop in and see Mr. Wilde for a moment or two." "Poor fellow," said Mr. with a shake of her head. "Must be hard to live alone for year after year, poor, crippled, and almost demented. It's very good of you, Mr. Castaigne, to visit him often as you do." "I think he is vicious," observed Halberg, beginning again with his hammer. I listened to the golden tinkle on the greave plates. When he had finished, I replied, "No, he is not vicious, nor is he in the least demented. His mind is a wonder chamber, from which he can extract treasures that you and I would give years of our life to acquire." Halberg laughed. I continued a little impatiently. "He knows history as no one else I know it. Nothing, however trivial, escapes his search, and his memory is so absolute, so precise in details, that were it known to New York that such a man existed, the people could not honor him enough." "Nonsense," muttered Halberg, searching on the floor for a fallen rivet. "It is nonsense," I asked, managing to suppress how I felt. "Is it nonsense when he says that the tassets and cuissards of the enamelled suit of armor, commonly known as the Prince's Emblazoned, can be found among a mass of rusty theatrical properties, broken staves and rag-pickers' refuse in a garret in Pell Street?" Halberg's hammer fell to the ground, but he picked it up and asked, with a great deal of calm, how I knew that the tassets and left cuissard were missing from the Prince's Emblazoned. "I did not know until Mr. Wilde mentioned it to me the other day. He said they were in the garret of 998 Pell Street." "Nonsense," he cried, but I noticed his hand trembling under his leather apron. "Is this nonsense, too?" I asked pleasantly. "Is it nonsense when Mr. Wilde continually speaks of you as the Marquis of Avonshire, and of Miss Constance—" I did not finish, for Constance had stared to her feet with terror written on every feature. Halberg looked at me, and slowly smoothed his leather apron. "That is impossible," he observed. "Mr. Wilde may know a great many things. About armor, for instance, and the Prince's Emblazoned," I interposed, smiling. "Yes," continued slowly, "about armor also. May be, but he is wrong in regard to the Marquis of Avonshire, who, as you know, killed his wife's traducer years ago, and went to Australia where he did not long survive his wife." "Mr. Wilde is wrong," murmured Constance. Her lips were blanched, but her voice was sweet and calm. "Let us agree, if you please, then, in this one circumstances. Mr. Wilde is wrong," I said. Part 2. I climbed the 3 dilapidated flights of stairs which I had so often climbed before, and knocked at a small door at the end of the corridor. Mr. Wilde opened the door and I walked in. When he had double-locked the door and pushed a heavy chest against it, he came and sat down beside me, peering up into my face with his little light-colored eyes. Half a dozen new scratches covered his nose and cheeks, and the silver wires which supported his artificial ears had become displaced. I had never seen him so hideously fascinating. He had no ears. The artificial ones which now stood out at an angle from the fine wire were his one weakness. They were made of wax and painted a shell pink, but the rest of his face was yellow. He might better have reveled in the luxury of some artificial fingers for his left hand, which is absolutely fingerless, but it seemed to cause him no inconvenience, and he was satisfied with his wax ears. He was very small, scarcely higher than a child of 10, but his arms were magnificently developed, and his thighs as thick as an athlete's. Still, the most remarkable thing about Mr. Wilde was that a man of his marvelous intelligence and knowledge should have such a head. It was flat and pointed, like the heads of many of those fortunates whom people imprison in silence for the weak-minded. Many called him insane. I knew him to be as sane as I was. I do not deny that he was eccentric. The mania he had for keeping that cat and teasing her until she flew at his face like a demon was certainly eccentric. I could never understand why he kept the creature, nor in what pleasure he found in shutting himself up in his room with this surly, vicious beast. I remember once glancing up from the manuscript I was studying by the light of some tallow dips, and seeing Mr. Wilde squatting motionlessly at his high chair, his eyes fairly blazing with excitement, while the cat, which had risen from her place before the stove, came creeping across the floor right at him. Before I could move, she flattened her belly to the ground, crouched, trembled, and sprang into his face. Howling and foaming, they rolled over and over on the floor, scratching and clawing, till the cat screamed and fled under the cabinet. Mr. Wilde turned over on his back, his limbs contracting and curling up like the legs of a dying spider. He was eccentric. Mr. Wilde had climbed up into his high chair, and after studying my face, picked up a dog's-eared ledger and opened it. Henry B. Matthews, he read, bookkeeper with Wysott and Company, dealers in church ornaments, called April 3rd, reputation damaged on the racetrack, known as a welcher, reputation to be repaired by August 1st, retainer $5. He turned the page and ran his fingerless knuckles down the closely written columns. P. Green Dusenberry, minister of the gospel, Fairbeach, New Jersey. Reputation damage in the Bowery, to be repaired as soon as possible. Retainer $100. Cofton edit, called April 6th. Then you are not in need of money, Mr. Wilde, I inquired. Listen, coughed again. It says C. Hamilton Chester of Chester Park, New York City, called April 7th. Reputation damage at Dieppe, France, to be repaired by October 1st. Retainer $500. Note: C. Hamilton Chester, Captain USS Avalanche, ordered home from the South Sea Squadron, October 1st. Well, I said, the profession of a repairer of reputations is lucrative. His colorless eyes sought mine. I only wanted to demonstrate that I was correct. You said it was impossible to succeed as a repairer of reputations, that even if I did exceed in certain cases, it would cost me more than I would gain by it. Today I have 500 men in my employ, who are poorly paid, but to pursue the work with an enthusiasm which may possibly be born of fear. These men enter every shade and grade of society. Some even are pillars of the most exclusive social temples. Others are the prop and pride of the financial world. Still others hold undisputed sway among the fancy and the talent. I choose them at my leisure. For those who rely to my advancements, it is easy. They are all cowards. I could triple the number in 20 days if I wished. So you see, those who have in their keeping the reputation of their fellow citizens, I have in my pay. They may turn on you, I suggested. He rubbed his finger over his crooked ears and adjusted the wax substitutes. I think not, he murmured thoughtfully. I seldom have to apply the whip, and then only once. Besides, they like their wages. How do you apply the whip? I demanded. His face for a moment was awful to look at. His eyes dwindled to a pair of green sparks. I invite them to come and have a little chat with me, he said in a soft voice. A knock at the door interrupted him, and his face resumed its amiable expression. Who is it? He inquired. Mr. Stalet, was the answer. Come tomorrow, replied Mr. Wilde. Impossible, began the other, silenced by a sort of bark from Mr. Wilde. Come tomorrow, he repeated. We heard somebody move away from the door and turn the corner by the stairway. Who is that? I asked. Arnold Stylate, owner and editor and the chief of the great New York Daily. He drummed on the ledger with his fingerless hand, adding, I pay him very badly, but he thinks it is a good bargain. Arnold Stylate, I repeated, amazed. Yes, said Mr. Wilde with a self-satisfied cough. The cat, which had entered the room as he spoke, hesitated, looked up at it, and snarled. He climbed down from the chair, and squatting on the floor, he took the creature into his arms and caressed her. The cat ceased snarling and presently began a loud purring, which seemed to increase in timbres as he stroked her. Where are the notes? I asked. Pointed at the table, and for the 100th time I picked up the bundle of manuscript entitled The Imperial Dynasty of America. One by one I studied the well-worn pages, worn only by my own handling, and although I knew all by heart from the beginning, when from Carcosa, the Hyades, Hastur, and Aldobrand, to Castaigne, Louis de Cavallados, born December 19th, 1877. I read it with an eager, rapt attention, pausing to repeat the parts of it aloud and dwelling especially on the Hildred de Calvados, only son of Hildred Castaigne, and Edith Landis Castaigne, first in succession, etc., etc. When I finished, Mr. Wilde nodded and coughed. Speaking of your legitimate ambition, he said, how do Constance and Louis get along? She loves him, I replied simply. The cat on his knee suddenly turned and struck at his eye, and he flung her off and climbed on the chair opposite me. And Dr. Archer? But that's a matter you can settle at any time you wish, he added. Yes, I replied. Dr. Archer can wait, but it is time I saw my cousin Louis. It is time, he repeated. Then he took another ledger from the table and ran over the leaves rapidly. We are now in communication with 10,000 men, he muttered. We can count on 100,000 within the first 28 hours. And in 48 hours the state will rise in mass. The country follows the state, and the portion that will not, California and the Northwest, might better never have been inhabited, shall not send them the yellow sign. The blood rushed to my head, but I only answered, A new broom sweeps clean. The ambition of Caesar and of Napoleon pales before that which could not rest until it had seized the minds of men and controlled even their unborn thoughts, said Mr. Wilde. You are speaking of the king in yellow, I groaned with a shudder. He is a king whom emperors have served. I am content to serve him, I replied. Mr. Wilde sat rubbing his ears with his crippled hands. Perhaps Constance does not love him, he suggested. Sorry to reply, but a sudden burst of military music from the street below drowned my voice. The 20th Dragoon Regiment, formerly in this garrison at Mount St. Vincent, was returning from the maneuvers in Westchester County to its new barracks on East Washington Square. It was my cousin's regiment. They were a fine lot of fellows in their pale blue, tight-fitting jackets, jaunty busbies, and white riding breeches, with a double yellow stripe into which their limbs seemed molded. Every other squadron was armed with lances, from the metal points of which fluttered yellow and white pennons. The band passed, playing the regimental march, which then came the colonel and the staff, the horses crowding and trampling, with their heads bobbed in unison, and the pennons fluttered from their lance points. The troopers who rode with the beautiful English seat looked down at berries from their bloodless campaign among the farms of Westchester, and the music of their sabers against the stirrups and the jingle of spurs and carbines was delightful to me. I saw Louis riding with his squadron. He was as handsome an officer as I have ever seen. Mr. Wilde, who had mounted a chair by the window, saw him too, but said nothing. Lewis turned and looked straight at Halbert's shop as he passed, and I could see the flush on his brown cheeks. I think Constance might have been at the window. The last trooper had fluttered by, and the last person vanished into the South Fifth Avenue. Mr. Wilde clambered out of his chair and dragged the chest away from the floor. "Yes," he said. "It's time that you saw your cousin Lewis." He unlocked the door, and I picked up my hat and stick and stepped into the corridor. The stairs were dark. Groping about, I set my foot on something soft, which snarled and spit, and I aimed a murderous blow at the cat. My cane shivered to splinters against the balustrade, and the beast scurried back into Mr. Wilde's room. Passing the Halbert's door again, I saw him still at work on the armor, but I did not stop. Stepping out into Bleecker Street, I followed it to Worcester, skirted the grounds. Pardon me? I followed it to Worcester, skirted the grounds of the Lethal Chamber. Crossing Washington Park, went straight to my room in the Beandick. Here I lodged comfortably, reading the Herald and the Meteor. Finally went to the steel safe in my bedroom, and set the time combination. 3 3/4 minutes, which it was necessary to wait when the time lock is opening, are to me golden moments. From the instant I set the combination to the moment when I gasp the knobs and swing back the solid steel golden moments. The solid steel door as I lived in ecstasy of expectation. Those moments must be like moments passed in paradise. I knew what I am to find at the end of the time limit. I know what the massive safe holds secure for me alone, and the exquisite pleasure of waiting is oddly enhanced when the safe opens and I lift from its velvet crown a diadem of purest gold blazing with diamonds. I do this every day, and yet the joy of waiting and at last touching again the diadem only to seem to increase as the days pass. It is a diadem fit for a king among kings, an emperor among emperors. The king in yellow might scorn it, but it should be worn by his royal servant. I held it in my arms until the alarm in the safe rang harshly, and then, tenderly, proudly, I replaced it and shut the steel doors. I walked slowly down back into my study, when the face is Washington Square, and leaned on the windowsill. The afternoon sun poured into my windows, and a gentle breeze stirred the branches of the elm and maple in the park, now covered with buds and tender foliage. A flock of pigeons circled about the tower of the Memorial Church, sometimes alighting on purple-tiled roof, sometimes wheeling downward at the lotus fountain in front of the marble. Downward to the lotus fountain in front of the marble arch. The gardeners were busy with flower beds across the fountain, and the freshly turned earth smelled sweet and spicy. A lawnmower, driven by a fat white horse, clinked across the green sward. Watering carts poured showers of spray over the asphalt drives, around the statue of Peter Stuyvesant, and across the green sward, and the watering cans poured showers of spray over the asphalt drives. Around the statue of Pete Inisvat, which in 1897 had replaced the monstrosity supposed to represent Garibaldi, children played in the spring sunshine, and nursery girls filled elaborate baby carriages with a reckless disregard for the pasty-faced occupants, which could probably be explained by the elegance of half a dozen trim dragoon troopers languidly lolling on the benches. The trees, the Washington Memorial Arch, glisten like silver in the sunshine, and beyond on the eastern extremity of the square, the gray stone barracks of the dragoons and the white granite artillery stables were alive with color and motion. I looked at the lethal chamber on the corner of the square opposite. A few curious people still lingered about the gilded iron railing, but inside the grounds the paths were deserted. I watched the fountains ripple and sparkle. The sparrows had already found this new bathing nook, and basins were covered with dusty, feathered little things. 2 or 3 white peacocks pulled their way across the lawns, and a drab-colored pigeon sat so motionless in the arm of one of the fates that it seemed to be alive at the part of the sculptured stone. As I was turning careless away, a slight commotion of the group of curious loiterers around the page attracted my attention. A young man had entered, and was advancing with nervous strides along the gravel path, which leads to the bronze doors of the lethal chamber. He paused a moment before the fates. As he raised his head to those 3 mysterious faces, the pigeon rose from its sculpted perch, circled about for a moment, and wheeled to the east. The young man pressed his hand to his face, and then, with an undefinable gesture, sprang up the marble steps. The bronze door closed behind him, and half an hour later, the loiterers slouched away, and the frightened pigeon returned to its perch in the arm of fate. I put on my hat and went out into the park for a little walk before dinner. As I crossed the central driveway, a group of officers passed, and one of them called out, "Hello, Hildred," and came to shake hands with me. It was my cousin Lewis, who stood smiling and tapping his spurred heels with his riding whip. "Just back from Westchester," said. "Been doing the colic, milk and curds, with dairy maids and sub-bonnets. Who say, how, and I don't think when you tell them they are pretty. I'm nearly dead for a square meal at Delmonico's. What's the news?" "There is none," I replied pleasantly. "I saw your regiment coming in this morning." "Did you? I didn't see you. Where were you?" "In Mr. Wilde's window." "Oh, hell," he began impatiently. "That man is stark mad. I don't understand why you—" He saw how annoyed I felt by the outburst, and begged my pardon. "Really, old chap," he said, "I don't mean to run down a man you like, but for the life of me I can't see what the deuce you find in common with Mr. Wilde. He's not well-bred, to put it generously. He is hideously deformed. His head is the head of a criminally insane person. You know yourself he's been in an asylum." "So have I interrupted calmly. Lewis looked startled and confused for a moment, but recovered and slapped me hardly on the shoulder. "You were completely cured," he began, but I stopped him again. "I suppose you mean that I was simply acknowledged never to have been insane." "Of course that's what I meant," he laughed. It's like his laugh because I knew it was forced. But I nodded gaily and asked him where he was going. Lewis looked after his brother officers, who had now almost reached Broadway. "We had intended to sample a Brunswick cocktail, but to tell you the truth, I was anxious for an excuse to go and see Hauberk instead. Come along, I'll make you my excuse." We found old Hauberk, neatly attired in fresh spring suit, standing at the door of his shop and sniffing the air. "I had just decided to take Constance for a little stroll before dinner," he replied to the impetuous volley of questions from Lewis. "We thought of walking on the park terrace along the river." Moment, Constance appeared and grew pale and rosy, but turns as Lewis bent over her small gloved fingers. I tried to accuse myself, alleging an engagement uptown, but Lewis and Constance would not listen, and I saw I was expected to remain and engage old Hauberk's attention. After all, it would be just as well if I kept my eye on Lewis, I thought, and when they hailed the Spring Street horse car, I got in after them and took my seat beside the armorer. There. Okay, we need to run an ad break. So just be 3 minutes. I'll put on words on stream. I'm gonna do that, and then I will be right back. Okay, and we're back. Okay, turn that volume just back down a smidge. Go. Let's see. The beautiful line of parks and granite terraces overlooking the wharves along the North River were built in 1910 and finished in the autumn of 1917, and become one of the most popular promenades in the metropolis. They extend from the Battery to 190th Street, overlooking the noble river and affording a fine view of the Jersey Shore and the highlands opposite. Cafes and restaurants were scattered here and there among the trees, and twice a week military bands from the garrison played in the kiosks and on the parapets. We sat down in the sunshine on the bench at the foot of the equestrian statue of General Sheridan. Constance tipped her sunshade to shield her eyes, and she and Lewis began a murmuring conversation which was impossible to catch. Old Hauberk, leaning on his ivory-headed cane, lighted an excellent cigar, the mate to which I politely refused, and smiled at vacancy. The sun hung low above the Staten Isle woods, and the bay were dialed in golden hues reflected from the sun-warmed sails of the shipping in the harbor. Brigs, schooners, yachts, clumsy ferry boats, their decks swarming with people, railroad transports carrying lines of brown, blue, and white freight cars, stately sound steamers, the Classe A tramp steamers, coasters, dredgers, scows, and everywhere pervading the entire bay. Impudent little tugs, puffing and whistling officiously. These were the craft which churned the sunlight waters as far as the eye could reach. In calm contrast to the hurry of sailing vessel and steamer, a silent fleet of white warships lay motionless in midstream. Constance's merry laugh aroused me from my reverie. "What are you staring at?" she inquired. "Nothing. The fleet," I smiled. Then Lewis told me what the vessels were, pointing on each by its relative position to the old red fort on Governor's Island. "That little cigar-shaped thing is a torpedo boat," he explained. "There are 4 more lying close together. They are the Tarpon, the Falcon, the Sea Fox, and the Octopus. The gunboats just above the Princeton, the Champlain, the Stillwater, and the Erie. Next to them lie the cruisers Farragut and Los Angeles, and above them the battleships California and Dakota, and the Washington, which is the flagship. Those 2 squatty-looking chunks of metal which are anchored there off Castle William are the double-turned monitors, terrible and magnificent. Behind them lies the ram Osceola." Constance looked at him with deep approval in her beautiful eyes. "Loads of things you know for a soldier," she said, and we all joined in the laugh which followed. Presently, Lewis rose with a nod to us and offered his arm to Constance. They strolled away along the river. Hauberk watched them for a moment and then turned to me. "Mr. Wilde was right. I found the missing tassets and left Cuissard of the Prince's emblazoned, and a vile old junk garret in Pell Street." 998? I inquired with a smile. "Yes." "Mr. Wilde is a very intelligent man," I observed. "I want to give him the credit of this most important discovery," continued Hauberk. "I intend it shall be known that he is entitled the fame of it." "He won't thank you for that," I answered sharply. "Please say nothing about it." "Do you know what it is worth?" said Hauberk. "No, $50, perhaps. It is valued at $500. But the owner of the Princeton's Embladen will give $2,000 to the person who completes his suit. That reward also belongs to Mr. Wilde." "He doesn't want it. He refuses it," I answered angrily. "Do you know about Mr. Wilde? He doesn't need the money. He is rich, or will be, richer than any man except myself. What will we care for money then? We care, he and I, when what?" demanded Hauberk, astonished. You will see, I replied on my guard again. He looked at me narrowly, much as Dr. Archer used to, and I knew he thought I was mentally unsound. Perhaps it was fortunate for him that he did not use the word lunatic just then. No, I replied to his unspoken thought. I'm not mentally weak. My mind is as healthy as Mr. Wilde's. I do not care to explain just what I have on hand, but it's an investment which will pay more than mere gold, silver, and precious stones. It will secure the happiness and prosperity of a continent. Yes, a hemisphere. Oh, said Mr. Burke. Eventually, I continued more quietly. Secure the happiness of the whole world. Incidentally, your own happiness and prosperity as well as Mr. Wilde's? Exactly, as I smiled. But I could have throttled him for taking that tone. He looked at me in silence for a while and then said very gently, Why don't you give up your books and studies, Mr. Castaigne, and take a tramp among the mountains somewhere or other? Used to be fond of fishing. Take a cast or two with the trout at Rangley's. I don't care for fishing anymore, I answered, without a shade of annoyance in my voice. Used to be fond of everything, continued. Athletics, yachting, shooting, riding. I have never cared to ride ever since my fall, I said quietly. Yes, your fall, he repeated, looking away from me. I thought this nonsense had gone far enough. So I brought the conversation back to Mr. Wilde. He was scanning my face, again in a manner highly offensive to me. Mr. Wilde, he repeated. Do you know what he did this afternoon? He came downstairs and nailed a sign over the hall door next to mine. It read, Mr. Wilde, repairer of reputations. Third bell. Do you know what a repairer of reputations can be? I do, I replied, suppressing the rage within. Oh, he said again. Lewis and Constance came strolling by and stopped to ask if we would join them. Halbach looked at his watch. At the same moment, a puff of smoke shot from the castmates of Castle William, and the boom of the sunset gun rolled across the water, and it was re-echoed in the islands opposite. The flag came running down from the flagpole. The bugles sounded on the white decks of the warships, and the first electric lights sparkled out from the Jersey shore. As I turned into the city which Halbach, I heard Constance murmur something to Lewis which I did not understand. Lewis whispered, My darling, in reply. And again, looking ahead with Halbach, through the square I heard a murmur of sweetheart and my own Constance. And I knew the time had nearly arrived when I should speak of important matters with my cousin Lewis. Just a moment. Part 3. One morning early in May, I stood before the steel safe in my bedroom, trying on the golden jeweled crown. The diamonds flashed fire as I turned into the mirror, and the heavy beaten gold burned like a halo about my head. I remember Camelia's agonized scream and the awful words echoing through the dim streets of Carcosa. They were the last lines in the first act, and I dared not think of what followed. Dared not, even in the spring sunshine, weren't there in my own room, surrounded with familiar objects, reassured by the bustle from the street and the voices of the servants in the hallway outside. For those poison words had dropped slowly into my heart, as death sweat drops upon a bedsheet and is absorbed. Trembling, I put the diadem from my head and wiped my forehead. But I thought of Hastur, and of my own rightful ambition, and I remembered Mr. Wilde as I had last left him, his face all torn and bloody from the claws of that devil's creature. And what he said. He said the alarm bell in the safe began to whir harshly, and I knew my time was up. But I would not heed it. And replacing the flashing circlet on my head, I turned defiantly to the mirror. I stood for a long time absorbed in the changing expression of my own eyes. The mirror reflected a face which was like my own, but whiter, and so thin that I had hardly recognized it. And all the time I kept repeating between my clenched teeth, "The day has come. The day has come." While the alarm in the safe whirled and clamored, the diamonds sparkled and flamed above my brow. I heard a door open, but did not heed it. It was only when I saw two faces in the mirror. It was only when another face rose over my shoulder, and two others' eyes met mine. I wheeled like a flash and seized a long knife from my dressing table, and my cousin sprang back very pale, crying, "Hildred, for God's sake!" As hand fell, he said, "Is I Lewis? Do you know me?" I stood silent. Could not have spoken for my life. He walked up to me and took the knife from my hand. "What is this?" he inquired in a gentle voice. "Are you ill?" "No," I replied, but I doubt he heard me. "Come, come, old fellow," he cried. "Take off that brass crown and toddle into the study. Going to a masquerade? What's all this theatrical tinsel anyway?" I was glad he thought the crown was made of brass and paste, yet I didn't like him any the better for thinking so. I let him take it from my hand, knowing it was best to humor him. He tossed the splendid diadem in the air, and catching it, turned to me smiling. "It's as dear at 50 cents, he said. "What's it for?" I did not answer, but took the circlet from his hands and placed it in the safe, shut the massive steel door. The alarm ceased its infernal din at once. He watched me curiously, but did not seem to notice the sudden ceasing of the alarm. He did, however, speak of the safe as a biscuit box. Fearing lest he might examine the combination, I led the way into my study. Lewis threw himself on the sofa and flicked flies with his eternal riding whip. He wore his fatigue uniform with the braided jacket and jaunty cap, and I noticed that his riding boots were all splashed with red mud. "Where have you been?" I inquired. "Jumping mud creeks in Jersey," he said. "I've had time to change yet. I was rather in a hurry to see you. But you got a glass of something? I'm dead tired. Been in the saddle 24 hours. I gave him some brandy from my medicinal store, which he drank with a grimace. "Damn bad stuff," he observed. "I'll give you an address where they sell brandy that is brandy." "It's good enough for my needs," I said indifferently. "I use it to rub my cheeks with." He stared and flicked at another fly. "See here, old fellow," he began. "I've got something to suggest to you. It's 4 years now that you've shut yourself up in here like an owl. Never going anywhere, never taking any healthy exercise. Never doing a damn thing but poring over those books up there on the mantelpiece." He glanced along the row shelf. "Napoleon, Napoleon, Napoleon," he read. "For heaven's sake, have you nothing but Napoleon there?" "I wish they were bound in gold," I said. "Wait, yes, there is another book, The King in Yellow." I looked him steadily in the eye. "Have you read it?" asked I. "No, thank God, I don't want to be driven crazy." I saw he regretted his speech as soon as he had uttered it, saying one word which I loathe more than I do lunatic, and that word is crazy. But I controlled myself and asked him why he thought The King in Yellow dangerous. "Oh, I don't know," he said hastily. "I remember the excitement it created and the denunciations from the pulpit and press. I believe the author shot himself after bringing forth this monstrosity, didn't he?" "I understand he is still alive," I answered. "That's probably true," he muttered. "Bullets couldn't kill a fiend like that." "It is a book of great truths," I said. "Yes," he replied, "of truths, which send men frantic and blast their lives. I don't care if the thing is, as they say, the very supreme essence of art. It's a crime to have written it, and I for one shall never open its pages." "Is that what you've come to tell me?" I asked. "No," he said. "I come to tell you that I'm going to be married." I believe for a moment my heart ceased to beat. but I kept an eye on his face. Yes, he continued, smiling happy. Married to the sweetest girl on earth, Constance Halberg, I cried mechanically. How did you know? He cried, astonished. I didn't know it myself until that evening last April. I strolled down the moment before dinner. When is it to be? I asked. 'Twas to have next September, but an hour ago a dispatch came ordering our regiment to the Presidio San Francisco. We leave at noon tomorrow. Tomorrow, he repeated. Just think, Hildred. Tomorrow I shall be the happiest fellow that ever drew breath in this jolly world, for Constance will go with me. I hard from him my hand in congratulation. He seized it and shook it like the good-natured fool he was, or pretended to be. I'm going to get my squadron as a wedding present, he rattled on. Captain and Mrs. Louis Castaigne. Hildred? Then he told me where it was to be, and who were to be there. Make me promise come and be the best man. I set my teeth and listened to his boyish chatter, showing what I felt, but I was getting to the limit of my endurance. When he jumped up and switched his spur till they jingled, set to go, I did not detain him. There's one thing I want to ask of you, I said quietly. Out with it, it's promised, he laughed. I want you to meet me for a quarter of an hour's talk tonight. Of course, if you wish, he said, somewhat puzzled. Where? Anywhere in the park there. What time, Hildred? Midnight. The name of... he began, but checked himself and laughingly assented. Watch him go the stairs and hurry away, his saber banging at every stride. He turned into Bleecker Street, and I knew he was going to see Constance. I gave him 10 minutes to disappear, and then followed in his footsteps, taking with me the jeweled crown and the silken robe embroidered with the yellow sign. When I turned into Bleecker Street and entered the doorway which bore the sign, Mr. Wilde, repairer of reputations, third bell. I saw old Halberg moving about in his shop, and imagined I heard Constance's voice in the parlor, but I avoided them both. I hurried up the trembling stairway to Mr. Wilde's apartment. I knocked and entered without ceremony. Mr. Wilde lay groaning on the floor, his face covered with blood, his clothes torn to shreds. Drops of blood were scattered about over the carpet, which had also been ripped and frayed in the evidently recent struggle. It's that cursed cat, he said, his groans, turning his colourless eyes to me. She attacked me while I was asleep. I believe she wills to kill me yet. This was too much, so I went to the kitchen, seizing a hatchet from the pantry, started to find the infernal beast and settle her then and there. My search was fruitless. After all, I gave it up and came back to find Mr. Wilde squatting on his high chair by the table. He had washed his face and changed his clothes. The great furrows which the catcalls had ploughed up his face, yet filled with collodion, and a rag hid the wound in his throat. I told him I should kill the cat when I came across her, but he shook his head and turned to the open ledger before them. He read name after name of the people who had come to him and guarded their reputations. The sums he had amassed were startling. I put on the screws now and then, he exclaimed. One day or other, some of the people will assassinate you, I insisted. Do you think so? He said, rubbing his mutilated ears. It was useless to argue with him, so I took down the manuscript entitled Imperial Dynasty of America. For the last time I should ever take it down in Mr. Wilde's study. I read it through, thrilling and trembling with pleasure. When I finished, Mr. Wilde took the manuscript and, turning to the dark passage which leads from his study to his bedchamber, in a loud voice, Vance, for the first time I noticed a man crouching there in the shadow. How I had overlooked him during my search for the cat, I cannot imagine. Vance, come in, cried Mr. Wilde. The figure rose and crept towards us, and I shall never forget the face that he raised to mine, as the light from the window illuminated it. Vance, this is Mr. Castaigne, said Mr. Wilde. Finished speaking, the man threw himself on the ground before the table, crying and gasping, God, oh my God, forgive me. Mr. Castaigne, keep that man away. You cannot mean it. You are different. Save me. I've broken down. I was in a madhouse, and now... when all was going right, when I had forgotten the king in yellow, and... But I shall go mad again, I shall go mad. His voice died into a choking rattle, for Mr. Weld had leapt on him, and his right hand encircled the man's throat. When Vance fell in a heap on the floor, Mr. Weld clambered nimbly into the chair again, and rubbing his mangled ears with the stump of his hand, turned to me and asked for the ledger. I reached it down from the staff and opened it. After a moment searching in the beautifully written pages, he coughed complacently and pointed to the name Vance. Vance, he read aloud. Osgood Oswald Vance. Sound of his name, the man on the floor raised his head and turned a convulsed face to Mr. Wilde. His eyes were injected with blood, his lips tumefied. Called April 28th, continued Mr. Wilde. Occupation cashier in the Fourth National Bank. He served a term of forgery at Sing Sing, from whence he was transferred to the asylum for the criminally insane. Pardoned by the governor of New York and discharged from the asylum January 19th, 1918. Reputation damaged at Chepsea Bay. Rumors that he lives beyond his income. Reputation to be repaired at once. Retainer, $1,500. Note: his embezzled sums amounting to $30,000 since March 20th, 1919. Excellent family, and secure present position through uncle's influence. Father, president of the Seaforth Bank. I looked up at the man on the floor. Get up, Vance, said Mr. Wilde in a gentle voice, his voice as if hypnotized. You will do as we suggest now, observed Mr. Wilde. Opened the manuscript, read the entire history of the Imperial Dynasty of America. Then in a kind, soothing murmur, he ran over the important points with Vance, who stood like one stunned. His eyes were so blank and vacant that I imagined he had become half-witted, and remarked it to Mr. Wilde, who replied that it was of no consequence anyway. Very patiently, we pointed out to Vance what his share in the affair would be, and he seemed to understand. After a while, Mr. Wilde explained the manuscript, using several volumes on heraldry, to substantiate the result of his searches. He mentioned the establishment of the dynasty in Carcosa, the lakes which connected Hastur, Aldebaran, and the mystery of the Hyades. He spoke of Casilda and Camilla, and sounded the cloudy depths of Demhe, and the lake of Hali. The scalloped tatters of the king in yellow must hide Yetil forever, he muttered. But I do not believe Vance heard him. Then, by degrees, he led Vance along the ramifications of the imperial family to Oat and Thale, from Nato Alba and Phantom of Truth, to Aldonis, and then, tossing aside his manuscript and notes, he began the wonderful story of the last king. Fascinated, thrilled, I watched him. He threw up his head, his long arms were stretched out, magnificent gesture of pride and power, and eyes blazing deep in their sockets like two emeralds. Vance listened stupefied. As for me, and at last Mr. Wilde had finished, and pointing to me, cried, "The cousin of the king!" My head swam with excitement. Controlling myself with superhuman effort, explained to Vance why I alone was worthy of the crown and why my cousin must be exiled or die. I made him understand that my cousin must never marry, even after announcing all his claims, and how that least of all he should marry the daughter of the Marquis of Avonshire, and bring England into the question. I showed him a list of thousands of names which Mr. Wilde had drawn up. Every man whose name was there had received the yellow sign, which no living human being dared disregard. The city, the state, the whole land was ready to rise and tremble before the pallid mask. The time had come. The people should know the son of Hastur, and the whole world bow to the black stars which hang in the sky over Carcosa. Vance leaned on the table, his head buried in his hands. Mr. Wilde drew a rough sketch on the margin of yesterday's Herald with a bit of lead pencil. It was a plan of Hawberk's rooms. Then he wrote out the order and fixed the seal, and shaking like a palsied man, I signed my first writ of execution with my name, Hildred Rex. Mr. Wilde clambered the floor and unlocked the cabinet. I took a long square box from the first shelf. This he thought to be the table and opened. A new knife lay in the tissue paper inside, and I picked it up and handed it to Vance. along with the order and the plan of Halbark's apartment. Then Mr. Wilde told Vance he could go, and he went, shambling like an outcast of the slums. I sat for a while watching the daylight fade behind the square tower of the Judson Memorial Church, and finally, gathering up the manuscript and notes, took my hat and started for the door. Mr. Wilde watched me in silence. Then, when I stopped in the hall, I looked back. Mr. Wilde's small eyes were still fixed on me. Behind him, the shadows gathered in the failing light. Then I closed the door behind me and went out into the darkening streets. I had eaten nothing since breakfast, but I was not hungry. A wretched, half-starved creature who stood looking across the street at the lethal chamber noticed me and came up to tell me a tale of misery. I gave him money, I don't know why, and he went away without thanking me. An hour later, another outcast approached and whined his story. I had a blank bit of paper in my pocket, on which was traced the yellow sign, and I handed it to him. He looked at it stupidly for a moment, then with an uncertain glance at it, folded it with what seemed to me exaggerated care, and placed it in his bosom. The electric lights were sparkled among the trees, and the new moon shone in the sky above the lethal chamber. It was tiresome waiting in the square. I wandered from the Marble Arch to the artillery stables and back again to the Lotos Fountain. The flowers and grass exhaled a fragrance which troubled me. The jet of the fountain played in the moonlight, and the musical splash of falling drops reminded me of the tinkle of chain mail in Halbark's shop. But it was not so fascinating, and the dull sparkle of the moonlight on the water brought no such sensations of exquisite pleasure as when the sunshine played over the polished steel of a corselet on Halbark's knee. I watched the bats darting and turning above the water plants in the fountain basin, but their rapid, jerky flight set my nerves on edge, and then I went away again to walk aimlessly to and fro among the trees. The artillery stables were dark, but in the cavalry barracks, the officers' windows were brilliantly lighted, and the sally port was constantly filled with troopers in fatigue carrying straw and harness, and baskets filled with tin dishes. Twice the mounted sentry at the gate was changed while I wandered up and down the asphalt walk. I looked at my watch. It was nearly time. The light in the barracks went out one by one. The barred gate was closed, and every minute or two an officer passed in through the side wicket, leaving a rattle of accoutrements and a jingle of spurs in the night air. The square had become very silent. The last homeless loiterer had been driven away by the gray-coated park policeman. The car pardon me. The last homeless loiterer had been driven away by the gray-coated park policeman. The car tracks along Worcester Street were deserted, and the only sound which broke the stillness was the stamping of the sentry's horse and the ring of his saber against the saddle pommel. In the barracks, the officers' quarters were still lighted, and military servants passed and repassed before the bay windows. 12 o'clock sounded for the new spire of St. Francis Xavier. And at the last stroke of the sad-toned bell, a figure passed through the wicket beside the portcullis, returned the salute at the end of the sentry, crossing the street, entered the square, advanced toward the Benedict apartment house. "Lewis," I called. The man pivoted on his spurred heels and came straight toward me. "Is that you, Hildred?" "Yes, you're on time." I took his offered hand and we strolled toward the lethal chamber. He rattled on about his wedding and the graces of Constance and their future prospects, calling my attention to his captain's shoulder straps and the triple gold arabesque on his sleeve and fatigue cap. I believe I listened as much to the music of his spurs and sabers as I did to his boyish babble. At last we stood under the elms at the 4th Street corner of the square opposite the lethal chamber. Then he laughed and asked me what I wanted with him. I motioned him to a seat on the bench under the electric light, sat down beside him. He looked at me curiously, with the same searching glance which I hate and fear so in doctors. I felt the insult of his look, but he did not know it, and I carefully concealed my feelings. Well, old chap, he inquired, what can I do for you? I drew from my pocket the manuscript and notes of the Imperial Dynasty of America, and looking him in the eye, said, I will tell you. On your word as a soldier, promise me to read this manuscript from beginning to end without asking me a question. Promise me to read these notes in the same way, and promise me to listen what I have to tell later. I promise if you wish it, he said pleasantly. Give me the paper, Hildred. He began to read, raising his eyebrows with a puzzled, whimsical air, which made me tremble with suppressed rage. As he advanced, his eyebrows contracted and his lips seemed to form the word rubbish. Then he looked slightly bored, but apparently for my sake read, with an attempt at interest which presently ceased to be an effort. He started when the closing page he came to his own name, and when he came to mine he lowered the paper and looked sharply at for a moment, but he kept his word and resumed reading. I let the half-formed question die on his lips and answered. When he came to the end and read the signature of Mr. Wilde, he folded the paper carefully and returned it to me. I handed him the notes, and we settled back, pushing his fatigue cap up to his forehead with a boyish gesture, which I remembered so well in school. I watched his face as he read, and when he finished I took notes of the manuscript and placed them in my pocket. Then I unfolded a scroll marked with the yellow sign. He saw the sign, but he did not seem to recognize it, and I called his attention to it somewhat sharply. Well, he said, I see it. What is it? It is the yellow sign, I said angrily. Oh, that's it, is it? Said Lewis in that flattering voice which Dr. Archer used to employ with me, and would probably have employed again had I not settled his affair for him. I kept my rate down and answered as steadily as possible. Listen. Have you engaged your word? I'm listening, old chap, he replied soothingly, and speak very calmly. Dr. Archer, having by some means became possessed of the secret of the imperial succession, attempted to deprive me of my right, alleging that because of a fall from my horse 4 years ago, I had become mentally deficient. He presumed to place me under restraint in his own house in hopes of either driving me insane or poisoning me. I have not forgotten it. I visited him last night, and the interview was final. Lewis turned quite pale, but did not move. I resumed triumphantly. There are yet 3 people to be interviewed in the interests of Mr. Wilde and myself. They are my cousin Lewis, Mr. Hawberk, and his daughter Constance. Lewis sprang to his feet, and I rose also, and flung the paper marked the yellow sign to the ground. Oh, I don't need that to tell you what I have to say, I cried with a laugh of triumph. You must renounce the crown to me, do you hear? To me. He looked at me with a startled air, recovering himself kindly. Of course I renounce What is must renounce? The crown, I answered. Of course. Said, I renounce it. Come, old chap, I'll walk you back to your room with you. Don't try any of your doctor's tricks on me, I trembling with fear. Don't ask if you think I'm insane. Nonsense, he replied. Come, it's getting late, Hildred. No, I shouted. You must listen. You cannot marry. I forbid it. Do you hear? I forbid it. You shall renounce the crown. In reward, I grant you exile. If you refuse, you shall die. He tried to calm me, but I was roused at last, and drawing my long knife, barred his way. Then I told him how he would find Dr. Archer in the cellar with his throat open, and I laughed in his face when I thought of Vance and his knife, and the order signed by me. Ah, you are the king, I cried, but I shall be king. Who are you to keep me from empire over all the habitable earth? I was born the cousin of a king, but I shall be king. Stood white and rigid before me. Suddenly a man came running up 4th Street, entered the gate of the lethal temple, traveled the path to the bronze door at full speed, plunged into the death chamber with the cry of one demented, and I laughed until I whipped ears. But I had recognized Vance, and knew that Hawberk and his daughter were no longer in my way. Go, I cried to Lewis. You have ceased to be a menace. You will never marry Constance now, and if you marry anyone else in your exile, I will visit you as I did my doctor last night. Mr. Wilde takes charge of you tomorrow. Then I turned and darted into South Fifth Avenue. With a cry of terror, Lewis dropped his belt and saber and followed me like the wind. I heard him close behind me at the corner of Beaker Street, and I dashed him to the doorway under Halberg's sign. Cried, "Halt or I'll fire!" But when he saw that I flew up the stairs, leaving Halberg's shop floor, he left me. I heard him hammering and shouting at the door as were possible to arouse the dead. The doors opened, and I entered crying, "It is done, it is done! Let the nations rise and look upon their king." But I could not find Mr. Wilde, so I went to the cabinet and took the splendid diadem from this case. Then I drew on the white silk robe, embroidered with the yellow sign, and placed the crown upon my head. At last I was king, king by my right in Hastur. King because I knew the mystery of the Hades, and my mind had sounded the depths of the lake Hali. I was king. The first gray pencilings of dawn would raise a tempest which would shake 2 hemispheres. Then as I stood, my every nerve pitched to the highest tension, faint with joy and splendor of my thought. Without, in the dark passage, a man groaned. I seized the tallow dip and sprang to the door. The cat passed me like a demon. The tallow dip went out. My long knife flew swifter than she, and I heard her screech, and I knew that my knife had found her. For a moment I listened to her tumbling and thumping about in the darkness, and when her frenzy ceased, I lighted a lamp and split over my head. Mr. Wilde lay on the floor with his throat torn open. At first I thought he was dead, but as I looked, a green sparkle came into his sunken eyes. His mutilated hand trembled, and then a spasm stretched his mouth from ear to ear. For a moment my terror and despair gave place to hope, but as I bent over, his eyeballs rolled clean around in his head, and he died. Then, when I stood, transfixed with rage and despair, seeing my crown, my empire, every hope and every ambition, my very life lying prostrate with the dead master, they came, seized me from behind, and bound me until my veins stood out like cords, and my voice filled with the paroxysms of my frenzied screams, but I still raged, bleeding and infuriated among them, and more than one policeman felt my sharp teeth. Then when I could no longer move, they came near. I saw old Halberg, and behind him my cousin Louis' ghastly face. And farther away, in the corner, a woman, Constance, weeping softly. "I see it now," I shrieked. "You have seized the throne and the empire. Woe, woe to your crown with the crown of the king in yellow." Editor's note. Mr. Castaigne died yesterday in the asylum for criminal insane. And that is the end of that story. I like how it ends with just... I just how like with the editor's note. He died. Alright, next story. The Mask. Camilla. You, sir, should unmask. Stranger, indeed? Casilda. Deed, it's time. We have laid aside disguise, but you, stranger. I wear no mask. Camilla, terrified, aside to Casilda. No mask? No mask. The King in Yellow. Act 1, Scene 2. Although I knew nothing of chemistry, I listened fascinated. He picked up an Easter lily which Genevieve had brought that morning from Notre Dame and dropped into the basin. Instantly, the liquid lost its crystalline clearness. For a second, the lily was enveloped in milk-white foam, which disappeared, leaving the fluid opalescent. Changing tints of orange and crimson played over the surface, and then what seemed to be a ray of pure sunlight struck through the bottom where the lily was resting. At the same instant, he plunged his hand into the basin and drew out the flower. "There is no danger," he explained. "If you choose the right moment, that golden ray is the signal." He held the lily toward me, and I took it in my hand. It had turned to stone, the purest marble. You see, he said, it's without a flaw. What sculptor could reproduce it? The marble was white as snow, but in its depths of the veins of the lily were tinged with palest azure. The faint flush lingered deep in its heart. Don't ask me the reason of that, he smiled, noticing my wonder. I have no idea why the veins in heart are tinted, but they always are. Yesterday I tried one of Genevieve's goldfish. There it is. The fish looked as if sculpted in marble, but if you held it to the light, the stone was beautiful, veined with a faint blue, and from somewhere within came a rosy light, like the tint which slumbers in the opal. I looked into the basin. What's more, it seemed filled with clear as crystal. If I should touch it now, I demanded. I don't know, he replied, but you had better not try. There's one thing I'm curious about, I said. That is where the rays of sunlight come from. It looked like a sunbeam, true enough, he said. I don't know, it always comes when I immerse any living thing. Perhaps, he said, smiling, perhaps it's the vital spark of the creature escaping to the source from whence it came. I saw he was mocking, and threatened him with a mahl stick, but he only laughed and changed the subject. Stay to lunch. Genevieve will be here directly. I saw her going to early mass, I said. She looked as fresh and sweet as that lily before you destroyed it. Do you think I destroyed it? Said Boris gravely. Destroyed, preserved? How can we tell? He sat in the corner of a studio near his unfinished group of the eights. He leaned back on the sofa, twirling a sculptor's chisel and squinting at his work. By the way, he said, I have finished pointing up that old academic Ariadne, and I suppose it will have to go to the salon. It's all I have ready this year, but after the success the Madonna brought me, I feel ashamed to send a thing like that. The Madonna, an exquisite marble for which Genevieve had been the sensation of last year's salon. I looked at the Ariadne. It was a magnificent piece of technical work, but I agreed with Boris that the world would expect something better of him than that. Still, it was impossible now to think of finishing in time for the salon that splendid, terrible group, half shrouded in the marble behind me. The fates would have to wait. We were proud of Boris Yevane. We claimed him and he claimed us on the strength of his having been born in America, although his father was French and his mother was Russian. Everyone in the Beaux-Arts called him Boris, and yet there were only two of us whom he addressed in the familiar way, Jack Scott and myself. Perhaps my being in love with Genevieve had something to do with his affection for me. Not that it had ever been acknowledged between us, but after all was settled, and she had told me in tears in her eyes that it was Boris whom she loved, I went over to his house and congratulated him. The perfect cordiality of that interview did not deceive either of us. I always knew, although to one at least it was a great comfort. I do not think he and Genevieve ever spoke of the matter together, but Boris knew. Genevieve was lovely. The Madonna-like purity of her face might have been inspired by the Sanctus and Gounod's Mass. But I was always glad when she changed that mood for what we called her April maneuvers. She was often as variable as an April day, in the morning grave, dignified and sweet, at noon laughing, capricious at everything, whatever one least expected. I preferred her so rather than in that Madonna-like tranquility which stirred the depths of my heart. I was dreaming of Genevieve when we spoke again. What do you think of my discovery, Alec? I think it wonderful. I shall make no use of it, beyond satisfying my own curiosity as far as may be, and the secret will die with me. It would be rather a blow to sculpture, would it not? We painters lose more than we ever gain by photography. Boris nodded, along with the edge of the chisel. This new vicious discovery would corrupt the world of art. No, I shall never confide the secret to anyone, he said slowly. It would be hard to find anyone less informed about such phenomena than myself. But of course I had heard of mineral springs so saturated with silica that the leaves and twigs which fell into them were turned to stone after a time. I dimly comprehended the process, how the silica replaced the vegetable matter, atom by atom, and the result was a duplicate of the object in stone. This, I confess, had never interested me greatly, and as for the ancient fossils thus produced, they disgusted me. Boris, it appeared, feeling curiosity instead of repugnance, had investigated the matter, and had accidentally stumbled on a solution which, attacking the immersed object with the ferocity of unheard of, in a second did the work of years. This was all I could make out of the strange story he had just been telling me. He spoke again after a long silence. I'm almost frightened when I think of what I found. Scientists would go mad over the discovery. It was so simple, too. It discovered itself. When I think of that formula and that new element precipitated in metallic scales. What new element? Well, I haven't thought of naming it, and I don't believe I ever shall. There are enough precious metals now in the world to cut throats over. I pricked up my ears. Have you struck gold, Boris? No, better. Let's see here, Alec, he laughed, starting up. You and I have all we need in this world. How sinister and covetous you look already. I laughed too, and told him I was devoured by the desire for gold, and we had better talk of something else. So when Genevieve came in shortly, we turned our backs on alchemy. Genevieve was dressed in silvery gray from head to foot. The light glinted along the soft curves of her fair hair as she turned her cheek to Boris. Then she saw me and returned my greeting. She had never before failed to blow me a kiss from the tips of her white fingers, and I promptly complained of the omission. She smiled and held out her hand, which dropped almost before it had touched mine. Then she said, looking at Boris, "You must ask Alec to stay for luncheon." This was something new. She had always asked me herself until today. "I did," said Boris shortly. "And you said yes, I hope." She turned to me with a charming, conventional smile. I might have been an acquaintance of the day before yesterday. I made her a low bow. "Je vais bien l'honneur, madame." Refusing to take up our usual bantering tone, she murmured a hospitable little commonplace and disappeared. Boris and I looked at one another. "I'd better go home, don't you think?" I asked. "Hanged if I know," he replied frankly. We were discussing the advisability of my departure. Genevieve reappeared in the doorway without her bonnet. She was wonderfully beautiful, but her color was too deep and her lovely eyes were too bright. She came straight up to me and took my arm. "Luncheon is ready. Was I cross, Alec? Thought I had a headache, but I haven't. Come here, Boris." She slipped her other arm through his. "Alec knows that after you there is no one in the world whom I like as well as him. So if he sometimes feels snubbed, it won't hurt him." "Ah, le bonjour," I cried. "Who says there are no thunderstorms in April?" "Are you ready?" chanted Boris. "Aye, ready." And arm in arm we raced into the dining room, scandalizing the servants. After all, we were not so much to blame. Genevieve was 18, Boris was 23, and I not quite 21. That is section of part 1. Part 2. Some work that I was doing about this time on the decoration for Genevieve's boudoir kept me constantly at the quaint little hotel in the Rue Saint-Cécile. Boris and I in those days labored hard, but as we pleased, which was fruitfully, and we all three, with Jack Scott, idled a great deal together. One quiet afternoon I had been wandering alone over the house, examining curios, prying into odd corners, bringing out sweetmeats and cigars from strange hiding places, and at last I stopped in the bathing room. Boris, all over clay, stood there washing his hands. The room was built of rose-colored marble excepting the floor, which was tessellated in rose and gray. In the center was a square pool sunken below the surface of the floor. Steps led down into it. Sculptured pillars supported a frescoed ceiling. A delicious marble Cupid appeared to have just alighted on his pedestal at the upper end of the room. The whole interior was Boris's work and mine. Boris in his working clothes of white canvas, scraped the traces of clay and red modeling wax from his handsome hands, and coquetted over his work with the cupid. "I see you," he insisted. "Don't try to look the other way and pretend not to see me. You know who made you, you little humbug." It was always my role to interpret Cupid's sentiments in these conversations, and when my turn came in, I responded in such a manner that Boris seized my arm and dragged me toward the pool, declaring he would dunk me. The next instant, he dropped my arm and turned pale. "Good God," he said, "I forgot that the pool is full of the solution." I shivered a little and dryly advised him to remember better where he had stored the precious fluid. "Heaven's name, why do you keep such a small of that gruesome stuff here, of all places?" I asked. "I want to experiment on something large," he replied. "On me, for instance?" "Ah, that came too close for jesting. But I do want to watch the action of that solution on a more highly organized living body. There is that big white rabbit," he said, following me into the studio. Jack Scott, wearing a paint-stained jacket, came wandering in, appropriated all the oriental sweetmeats he could lay his hands on, looted the cigarette case. Finally, he and Boris disappeared together to visit the Luxembourg Gallery, where a new silver bronze by Rodin and a landscape of Monet's were claiming the exclusive attention of artistic France. I went back to the studio and resumed my work. It was a Renaissance screen which Boris wanted me to paint for Genevieve's boudoir. But the small boy who was unwittingly dawdling through a series of poses for it today refused all bribes to be good. He never rested an instant in the same position, and inside of 5 minutes, I had so many different outlines of the little beggar. "Are you posing, or are you executing a song and dance, my friend?" I inquired. "Whichever monsieur pleases," he replied with an angelic smile. Of course, I dismissed him for the day, and of course I paid him for the full time, that being the way we spoil our models. After the young imp had gone, I made a few perfunctory daubs at my work, but was so thoroughly out of humor that it took me the rest of the afternoon to undo the damage I had done. So at last I scraped my palette, struck my brushes in a bowl of black soap, and strolled into the smoking room. I really believe that, excepting Genevieve's apartments, no room in the house was so free from the perfume of tobacco as this one. It was a queer chaos of odds and ends, hung with threadbare tapestry. A sweet-toned old spinet, in good repair, stood by the window. There were stands of weapons, some old and dull, others bright and modern. Festoons of Indian and Turkish armor over the mantel. 2 or 3 good pictures, and a pipe rack. It was there that we used to come for new sessions and smoking. I doubt if any type of pipe ever existed which was not represented in that rack. When we had selected one, we immediately carried it somewhere else and smoked it, for the place was on the whole more gloomy and less inviting than any in the house. But this afternoon the twilight was so very soothing. The rugs and skins on the floor looked brown and soft and drowsy. The big couch was piled with cushions. I found my pipe and curled up there for an unaccustomed smoke in the smoking room. I had chosen one with a long, flexible stem, and lighting it fell to dreaming. After a while it went out, and I did not stir. I dreamed on and presently fell asleep. I awoke to the saddest music I had ever heard. The room was quite dark. I had no idea where it was. A ray of moonlight silvered one edge of the old spinet, and the polished wood seemed to exhale the sounds as a perfume floats above a box of sandalwood. Someone rose in the darkness and came away weeping quietly, and I was foolish enough to cry out, "Genevieve!" She dropped at my voice, and I had time to curse myself while I made a light and tried to raise her from the floor. She shrank away with a murmur of pain. She was very quiet and asked for Boris. I carried her to the divan, and went to look for him, but he was not in the house, and the servants were gone to bed. Perplexed and anxious, I hurried back to Genevieve. She lay where I had left her, looking very white. "I can't find Boris or any of the servants," I said. "I know," she answered faintly. She's gone to an appointment with Mr. Scott. I don't remember why when I sent you for him just now. But I can't get back in that case before tomorrow afternoon. Are you hurt? Did I frighten you into falling? Fool I am, but I was only half awake. Boris thought you would come home before dinner. So please excuse us for letting you stay here all this time. I have had a long nap, I laughed. So sound that I did not know whether I was still asleep or not when I found myself staring at a figure which was moving toward me and called out your name. You been trying the old spinet? Must have played very softly. I would tell 1,000 more lies worse than the one to see the look of relief that came into her face. She smiled adorably and said in her natural voice, I tripped on that wolf's head. I think my ankle is sprained. Please call Marie and then go home. I did as she bade me, and left her there when the maid came in. Okay, we gotta do an ad break. I'm very sorry. But we'll do that, and then we'll be right back in 3 minutes. Okay, and we're back. Okay, and okay. Section 3. At noon next day when I called, I found Boris walking restlessly about his studio. Genevieve is asleep just now, he told me. A sprain is nothing, but she... Why should she have such a high fever? The doctor can't account for it. Or else he will not, he muttered. Genevieve has a fever, I asked. I should say so. and has actually been a little lightheaded at intervals all night, the idea. Gay little Genevieve without a care in the world, and she keeps saying her heart's broken and she wants to die. My own heart stood still. Boris leaned against the door of his studio, looking down, his hands in his pockets, his kind, keen eyes clouded, a new line of triple dawn. For the mouth's good mark that made the smile. The maid had orders to summon him the instant Genevieve opened her eyes. Waited and waited, and Boris, growing restless, wondered about fussing with modeling wax and red clay. Suddenly he started for the next room. "Come and see my rose-colored bath full of death," he cried. "Is it death?" asked the humorous Rune. "You're not prepared to call it life, I suppose." As he spoke, he plucked a solitary goldfish squirming and twisting out of its globe. "We'll send this one after the other, wherever that is," he said. There was feverish excitement in his voice, a dull weight of fever lay on my limbs and on my brain as I followed him to the fair crystal pool with its pink-tinted sides. He dropped the creature in. Falling, its scales flashed with a hot orange gleam in its angry twistings and contortions. But the moment it struck the liquid, it became rigid and sank heavily to the bottom. Then came the milky foam, the splendid hues radiating on the surface, and then the shaft of pure serene light broke through the seemingly infinite depths. Boris plunged in his hand and drew out an exquisite marble thing, blue-veined, rose-tinted, and glistening with opalescent drops. "Child's play," he muttered, and looked angrily, really, longingly at me, as if I could answer such a question. But Jack Scott came in and entered the game, as he called it, with an ardor. Nothing would do but try to experiment the white rabbit then and there. I was willing that Boris should find distraction from his cares, but I hated to see the life go out of a warm, living creature, and I declined to be present. Picking up a book at random, I sat down in the studio to read. Alas, I had found The King in Yellow. After a few moments which seemed ages, I was putting it away with a nervous shudder, when Boris and Jack came in, bringing their marble rabbit. At the same time, the bell rang above, and a cry came from the sick room. Boris was gone like a flash. Next moment he called, "Jack, run for the doctor and bring him back with you, Alec. Come here." I went and stood at her door. A frightened maid came out in haste and ran away to fetch some remedy. Genevieve, sitting bolt upright with crimson cheeks and glittering eyes, babbled incessantly and resisted Boris' gentle restraint. He called me to help. At first my touch, she sighed and sank back, closing her eyes, and then, as we still bent above her, she opened her eyes again, looked straight into Boris' face, poor fever-crazed girl, and told her secret. The same instant our three lives turned into new channels. The bond that held us together snapped forever, and a new bond was forged in its place. For she had spoken my name, and as the fever tortured her, her heart poured out its load of hidden sorrow. Amazed and dumb, I bowed my head, while my face burned like a live coal, and the blood surged into my ears, stupefying me with its clamor. Incapable of movement, incapable of speech, I listened to her feverish words in an agony of shame and sorrow. I could not silence her. I could not look at Boris. Then I felt an arm upon my shoulder, and Boris turned a bloodless face to mine. "It's not your fault, Alec. Don't grieve so if she loves you." But he could not finish. The doctor stepped swiftly in the room, saying, "The fever." I seized Jack Scott and hurried him to the street, saying, "Boris would rather be alone." We crossed the street to our apartments, and that night, seeing he was going to be ill too, he went for the doctor again. The last thing I recollect with any distinctness was hearing Jack say, "For heaven's sake, doctor, what ails him to wear a face like that?" And I thought of the King in Yellow and the pallid mask. I was very ill for the strain of 2 years which I had endured since the fatal May morning when Genevieve murmured, "I love you, but I think I love Boris best," told on me at last. I had never imagined that it might become more than I could endure. Outwardly tranquil, I had deceived myself, although the inward battle raged night after night. and I, lying alone in my room, cursed myself for rebellious thoughts unloyal to Boris and unworthy of Genevieve. The morning always brought relief, and I returned to Genevieve and to my dear Boris with a heart washed clean by the tempest of the night. Never in word or deed, or thought while with them, I had ever betrayed my sorrow even to myself. The mask of self-deception was no longer a mask for me, it was part of me. Night lifted it, laying bare the stifled truths below. But there is no one to see except myself, and when the day broke the mask fell back again of its own accord. These thoughts passed through my troubled mind as I lay sick, but they were hopelessly entangled into visions of white creatures, heavy as stone, crawling about in Boris's bane, of the wolf's head on the rug, foaming and snapping at Genevieve, who lay smiling beside it. I thought, too, of the king in yellow, wrapped with the fantastic colors of his tattered mantle, and that bitter cry of Casilda, "Not upon us, O king, not upon us." Feverishly I struggled to put it from me, but I saw the lake of Hali, thin and blank, without a ripple or wind to stir it, and I saw the towers of Carcosa behind the moon. Aldebaran, the Hades, Altair Hastur, glided through the cloud rifts which fluttered and flapped as they passed like the scalloped tatters of the king in yellow. Among all these, one sane thought persisted. It never wavered, no matter what else was going on in my disordered mind, that my chief reason for existing was to meet some requirement of Boris and Genevieve. What this obligation was, its nature, was never clear. Sometimes it seemed to be protection, sometimes support. Through a great crisis, whatever it seemed to be for the time, it rested heavily only on me, and I was never so ill or so weak that I did not respond without my whole soul. There was always crowds of faces about me, mostly strange, but a few I recognize. Boris among them. Afterward, they told me that it could not have been, but I know that once at least he bent over me. It was only a touch, a faint echo of his voice, and the cloud settled back on my senses and I lost him. But he did stand there and bend over me once at least. At last, one morning, I woke to find the sunlight falling across my bed, and Jack Scott reading beside me. I had not strength enough to speak aloud, neither could I think, much less remember, but I could smile feebly. Jack's eyes met mine. Then he jumped and asked eagerly if I wanted anything. I could whisper, "Yes, Boris." Moved to the head of my bed and leaned down to arrange my pillow. I did not see his face, but he answered heartily, "You must wait, Alec. Too weak to see even Boris." I waited and I grew strong. Few days I was able to see whom I would, but meanwhile I had thought and remembered from that moment, when all the past grew clear again in my mind. I never doubted that I should do when the time came, and I felt sure that Boris would have resolved upon the same course so far as he was concerned. As for what pertained him to be alone, I knew he would see that also as I did. I no longer asked for anyone. I never inquired why no message came from them, why during the week I lay there waiting and growing stronger. I never heard their names spoken, preoccupied with my own searchings for the right way, and with my feeble but determined fight against despair. I simply acquiesced in Jack's reticence, taking for granted that he was afraid to speak of them, lest I should turn unruly and insist on seeing them. Meanwhile, I said over and over to myself, how would it be when life began again for us all? We would take our relations exactly as they were before Genevieve fell ill. Boris and I would be when life began. Boris and I would look into each other's eyes, and there would be neither rancor nor cowardice nor mistrust in that glance. I would be with them again for a while in the dear intimacy of their home, and then, without pretext or explanation, I would disappear from their lives forever. Boris would know. Genevieve, the only comfort was that she would never know. It seemed, as I thought it over, that I had found the meaning of the sense of obligation which had persisted all through my delirium, and the only possible answer to it, so that when I was quite ready, I beckoned Jack to me one day and said, "Jack, I want Boris at once. Take my dearest greeting to Genevieve." When at last he made me understand that they were both dead, I fell into a wild rage that tore all my little convalescent strength to atoms. I raved and cursed myself into a relapse, from which I crawled forth some weeks afterward. A boy of 21 believed that his youth was gone forever. I seemed to be past the capability of further suffering, and one day when Jack handed me a letter and keys to Boris' home, I took them without a tremor and asked them to tell me all. It was cruel of me to ask him, but there was no help for it, and he leaned wearily on thin hands to reopen the wound which would never entirely heal. He began very quietly. "Alec, unless you have a clue that I know nothing about, you will not be able to explain any more than I what has happened. I suspect that you would rather not hear these details, but you must learn them, else I would spare you the relation. God knows I wish I could be spared the telling. I shall use few words. That day when I left you in the doctor's care and came back to Boris, I found him working on the fates. Genevieve, he said, was sleeping under the influence of drugs. She had been quite out of her mind, he said. Kept on working, not talking anymore, and I watched him. Before long, I saw that the third figure of the group, the one looking straight ahead, out over the world, bore his face, not as you ever saw it, but as it looked then into the end. This is the one thing I should like to find an explanation, but I never shall. Well, he worked and I watched him in silence, and it went on until nearly midnight. Then we heard the door open and shut sharply, in a swift rush in the next room. Boris sprang through the doorway and I followed, but we were too late. She lay at the bottom of the pool, her hands across her breast. Then Boris shot himself through the heart. Jack stopped speaking. Drops of sweat stood under his eyes and his thin cheeks twitched. I carried Boris to his room, went back and let that hellish fluid out of the pool, and turning on all the water, washed the marble clear of every drop. And at length I dared descend the steps. I found her lying there as white as snow. At last, when I had decided what best to do, I went into the laboratory. First emptied the solution into the basin in the waste pipe. Then I poured the contents of every jar and every bottle after it. There was no wood in the fireplace, so I built a fire. And breaking the locks of Boris' cabinet, I burnt every paper, notebook, and letter that I found there. With the mallet from the studio, I smashed to pieces all the empty bottles. Then loading them into a coal shuttle, I carried them to the cellar and threw them over the red-hot bed for the furnace. 6 times I made the journey, and at last not a vestige remained of anything which might again aid in seeking for the formula which Boris had found. Sorry, okay. Then at last I dared call the doctor. He is a good man, and together we struggled to keep it from the public. Without him, I would never have succeeded. At last we got the servants paid and sent away into the country, where old Rosier keeps them quiet with stories of Boris and Genevieve's travel in distant lands from whence they won't return for years. We buried Boris in the little cemetery of Severe. The doctor is a good creature, and knows when to pity a man who can bear no more. He gave his certificate of heart disease and asked no questions of me. Then lifting his head from his hands, he said, "Open the letter, Alec. It's for us both." To open, it was Boris' will dated a year before. He left everything to Genevieve. In case of her dying childless, I was to take control of the house in Rue Saint-Cécile. Jack Scott, the management at a tier. Our deaths, the property reverted to his mother's family in Russia. With the exception of the sculpted marbles executed by himself, these he left to me. The page blurred under our eyes. Jack got up and walked to the window. Presently he turned and sat down again. I dreaded to hear what he was going to say, but he spoke with the same simplicity and gentleness. Genevieve lies before the Madonna in the marbled room. The Madonna bends tenderly above her. Genevieve smiles back into that calm face that would never have been except for her. His voice broke, but he grasped my hand, saying, "Courage, Alec. Next morning, he left for the apartment to fulfill his trust. Part 4. The same evening, I took the keys and went into the house I had known so well. Everything was in order, but the silence was terrible. Though I went twice to the door of the marble room, I could not force myself to enter it. It was beyond my strength. I went in the smoking room and sat down before the spinet. A small lace handkerchief lay on the keys, and I turned away, choking. It was plain I could not stay, so I locked every door, every window, and the 3 front and back gates and went away. Next morning, Alec packed my valet, and leaving him in charge of my apartments, I took the Orient Express for Constantinople. During the 2 years that I wandered through the East, at first in our letters, we never mentioned Genevieve and Boris, but gradually their names crept in. I recollect particularly a passage in one of Jack's letters, replying to one of mine. What you tell me of seeing Boris bending over you while you lay ill, feeling his touch on your face, hearing his voice, of course troubles me. This that you describe must have happened a fortnight after he died. I say to myself that you were dreaming, that was part of your delirium, but the explanation does not satisfy me, nor would it you. Toward the end of the 2nd year, a letter came from Jack to me in India, so unlike anything I had ever known of him that I decided to run at once to Paris. He wrote, I am well, still all my pictures as artists do have no need of money. I have not a care of my own, but I am restless, that if I had, I'm unable to shake off a strange anxiety about you. It is not an apprehension. It is rather a breathless expectancy of what, God knows. I can only say it is wearing me out. Nights I dream always of you and Boris. I can never recall anything afterward, but I wake in the morning with my heart beating, and all day the excitement increases until I fall asleep at night to recall the same experience. I am quite exhausted by it, determined to break up this morbid condition. I must see you. Shall I go to Bombay, or will you come to Paris? I telegraphed him to expect me by the next steamer. When we met, I thought he had changed very little. I, he insisted, looked in splendid health. It was good to hear his voice again, and as we chatted about what life was still held for us. As we sat and chatted about what life still held for us, we felt that it was pleasant to be alive in the bright spring weather. We stayed in Paris together a week, and then I went for a week to after with him. But at first, we went to the cemetery at Seville, where Boris lay. Shall we place the fates in the little grove above him? Jack asked, and I answered, I think only the Madonna should watch over Boris's grave. But Jack was none the better for my homecoming, the dreams of which he could not retain even the least definite outline continued. He said at times that since the breathless expectancy was suffocating. You see, I do you harm and not good, I said, to try a change without me. So he started alone for a ramble across the Channel Islands, and I went back to Paris. I had not yet entered Boris's home, now mine, since my return, but I knew it must be done. Been kept in order by Jack. There were servants there, so I gave up my own apartment and went there to live. Instead of the agitation I had feared, I found myself able to paint there tranquilly. I visited all the rooms, all but one. I could not bring myself to enter the marble room where Genevieve lay, and yet I felt the longing growing daily to look upon her face, to kneel beside her. One April afternoon, I lay dreaming in the smoking room just as I had lain 2 years before. Mechanically, I looked among the tawny eastern rugs for the wolfskin. At last I distinguished the pointed ears and the flat, cruel head, and I thought of my dream where I saw Genevieve laying beside it. The helmet still hung above the threadbare tapestry. Among them, the old Spanish morion which I remembered Genevieve had once put on when we were amusing ourselves with the ancient bits of mail. I turned my eyes to the spinet. Every yellow key seemed eloquent at her caressing hand, and I rose, drawn by the strength of my life's passion, to the sealed door of the marble room. The heavy door swung inward under my trembling hands. Sunlight poured through the window, tipping with gold the wings of Cupid, and lingered like a nimbus over the brows of the Madonna. A tender face bent in compassion over a marbled form so exquisitely pure that I knelt and signed myself. Genevieve lay in the shadow under the Madonna, yet through her white arms I saw the pale azure vein, and beneath her softly clasped hands the folds of her dress were tinged with rose. as if from some faint warm light within her breast. Bending with a breaking heart, I touched the marble drapery with my lips, then crept back into the silent house. A maid came and brought me a letter. I sat down in the little conservatory to read it, but as I was about to break the seal, seeing the girl linger, I asked for what she wanted. She stammered something about a white rabbit that had been caught in the house, and asked what should be done with it. I told her to let it loose in the walled garden behind the house, and opened my letter. It was from Jack, but so incoherent that I thought he must have lost his reason. It was nothing but a series of prayers to me not to leave the house until he could get back. He could not tell me why. They were the dreams, he said. He could explain nothing, but he was sure that I must not leave the house in Rue Saint-Cécile. As I finished reading, I raised my eye and saw the same servant, holding a glass dish in which 2 goldfish were swimming. "Put them back in the tank and tell me what you mean by interrupting me," I said. A suppressed whimper. She emptied water and fish into an aquarium at the end of the conservatory, to ask permission to leave my service. She said people were playing tricks on her, evidently with the design of getting her into trouble. The marble rabbit had been stolen, and a live one had been brought into the house. The 2 beautiful marble fish were gone, and she had found those common living things flopping on the dining room floor. Reassured her and sent her away, saying I would look about myself. I went into the studio. There was nothing but my canvas and some casts except the marble of the Easter lily. I saw it on the table room across the room. Then I strode angrily to the flower I lifted from the table as fresh and fragile it filled the air. Then I suddenly apprehended, and sprang through the hallway to the marble room. The door flew open, the sunlight streamed onto my face. Through it, in heavenly glory, the Madonna smiled, and Genevieve lifted her flushed face from her marble couch and opened her sleepy eyes. Bro was a little bit slow on the uptake there. I like that one. Okay. So we're gonna call it there for tonight. There are two short stories of, let's see, 1, 2, 6, 2. So we've done 2 of 10. So the next will continue next time with the story in the Court of the Dragon. Sounds pretty pog. Just said pog, didn't I? I have shamed myself. Alright, anyway, thank you so much, and I will see y'all next time when we'll be picking back up with this.